I want to just say to the elder who did the opening prayer, thank you. If any of the drum groups were here with us, Rick, my thanks to them. If not, hopefully later today. I'm always appreciative of our First Nations ambassadors and hosts, the drum groups. To any of the elders that have prayed for this conference leading up to it, I pray the Creator blesses them continually. To all of you who have come today, representing the City of Edmonton, federal government, provincial governments, the various organizations, welcome. To our community members who are here, and one of our foremost female entrepreneurs, Margaret Ward, it's good to see you. To Walter and the elders and everybody again, thank you for being here. For me, this area is so near and dear to my heart. When we talk about improving the quality of life for Aboriginal people, and not just Aboriginal mainstream, but to talk about Aboriginal communities in particular, which I'm one of the chiefs of, 46 tribes here in Alberta, 47. You know, you can't accomplish and do a lot of these things without fiscal resourcing. And over the last number of months, Canadians have seen the frustration, you know, with Tanya Capo and some of the group from Idle No More trying to work from their perspective and angle on peaceful action, peaceful demonstrations to try and get the attention of the federal government to say, look, some things need to change here. And more of these issues for First Nations need to be addressed. And don't go ahead and do things without consultation, especially with respect to the environment and all those things. We know what Idle No More stands for. But over and above Idle No More, there's been a longer battle. And the battle that we've had as chiefs is something that I have to say here today to many of you, and especially as a message to the federal government representatives, and it's simply this. As one of the chiefs, the absolute disrespect and patronization that's continuing to go on to us as leaders of our tribes on the reality of the problem that exists in our communities for the need for better housing, proper infrastructure, economic development, to carry out doing a lot of the functions that you guys are here to meet about in the next couple of days. I wish you all well in all your discussions and your dialogue, but we're dreaming here in such a way that the oppression has to stop. You know, for many of you professionals in the room, architects, engineers, and a number of you that I see who are First Nation, I'm so glad and so proud to see that. But it's almost like Canada is in such a state of denial. Denial that First Nations are going to be able to get out of this mass dilemma with giving them a little droplet of water from, you know, an aspirin for children's Tylenol or something, one little tiny drop on an ocean of challenges. Some stats I'll share with you here that I know of to be true, and it's probably low. The money that's announced by Canada recently, and the counterpart before me that got up and just spoke of some of the things the federal government's doing, Mr. Best. We have in Alberta alone about a $14 billion crisis needed in First Nation communities for infrastructure, housing, schooling, you name it. You go Canada-wide, 10 provinces and territories. I've said this, and some of you in this room may have heard me. It's a $100 to $150 billion crisis to try and allow First Nations to get up to a standard or a quality life that is just consistent with mainstream Canadians. So how the heck is announcing programs of 9 million and 50 million, 100 million going to do anything? We are fortunate at Enoch in that we have the resources from this casino that took us many years, myself personally, 16, 17 years, Took us 13 years before we got this built. And many of you in the First Nations who are here today, and many of you professionals who've worked with some of the First Nations know how hard it is just to get one project off the ground that can bring in some kind of sustainable revenue so they can do all those things that we're talking about here to build better housing, the quality of life that many Canadians enjoy. It takes money. But when I say Canada is dreaming or are in denial, I simply mean it from this fact. Many of you in this room have heard some of the media's slant on some of the challenges for First Nations. The Sun media disgusts me, and I'll wrap this up in just a few minutes with some of the opening remarks, but trying to share this with you. If I'm invited to speak, I'm going to speak truth on some of these issues. Because I want us to all in Canada, as First Nations, in mainstream society, to wake the hell up and realize the problem that does exist needs serious revenue. Not just a Band-Aid and not just a little beaker droplet of solution. The revenues in Canada were stolen, or the resources were stolen from First Nations. It's fact. It's truth and reality. But we understand, business and industry are never going to want to give that up. Life's too good for them right now. But be damned if industry and some of the people who live with that type of wealth and resources were ever going to have to, God forbid, share back with the First Nations a legitimate portion of what was rightfully theirs. It's almost like that is such a horror story or contemptible that we as First Nations chiefs would even try and present that fact or reality. So we're told, shut up. Some teachers have told some of the kids in classrooms recently, through these last number of months, get over it. The treaties, lands or resources. You know, it is what it is today. You guys got to get over that and move forward. Become Canadians and be a part of society like everyone else. Well, I'll tell you honestly, in all the years that the Creator allows me to be in leadership, I have a duty to my ancestors, as do all the chiefs, the people living presently and the ones coming after us, to ensure that the wrongs are righted. In Canada, I think what we're asking, and for a lot of you professionals here today, some of you which are allies, and some of you may be here because we're brown gold. You know? Some of you are here because, hey, you can make money off of us, you know, it's business. And that's not necessarily wrong. You have to earn a living too. But if Canada doesn't try to share with us, at least share back with us what was wrongfully stolen, then they're in denial. Canadians are in denial. History will continue to perpetuate the biggest myth and the biggest lie in Canadian history, that the resources that the Canadian and provincial governments all benefit from, and mainstream Canadians mainly benefit from, it's okay that you can just steal that from another people. Brush it under the rug and tell them, accept it, and move on. But find a way to get out of your dilemmas, and we wish you well. It's that type of patronizing BS that I believe has to stop. Now, my suggestion, and even with our neighbors here to the city of Edmonton, we haven't had a chance to sit down personally, but I have butted heads with your mayor on many occasions. Yes, and you know, there's going to be differences of opinions, right, with political colleagues. We've been battling like heck to try and get the water out here to do further economic development. In order to do that, you need money. You need roads and infrastructure with ingress or egress, ingress, whatever technical word you have to have so it's safe for all the commuters. But in order to do that, you need to work together, have proper planning departments, and you have to have the political will to say, yes, we're going to share and we're going to do this so you, Enoch, can prosper and you can create jobs for those Aboriginal people, and those Aboriginal people will then build a better quality of life. And as simple as that all sounds, the political nonsense that goes on, blocking us because they want to build up the Grange, Lewis Estates, Hamptons, and everything all around us. We know what's going on. We understand the game. And it's sad, and it's disgusting. But Enoch will work through that. And I hope that we have better alliances with yourself or other people who would come speak in our territories, who say all these nice things about what we're doing or Edmonton's doing for Aboriginal people, yet your closest neighbor, you want to help oppress. And you want to make sure that every little thing we try and do is near impossible because, hey, we can't have them be major competitors with us and get some of the retail and commercial development going before we finish it. You know, if I sound a little frustrated or come across a little bit bitter today, well, I've been doing this job now 12 of 20 years as a chief. 16 of the last 20 years I've been in the political arena. And I saw some of my predecessors as chiefs who've passed on now grow frustrated in their twilight years of being chieftainship, fighting the same battles that we as the next generation and several generations before me, the torch was passed on to with very little movement. When Canada and United States and the global economy started to have the meltdown, starting from the whole housing fiasco, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the whole 9 yards, we know it, Enron, and all the others, right? Injections were put into the economy to ensure that mainstream Canadians and mainstream US citizens didn't suffer too much, because a lot of them were losing their homes and they couldn't afford to put food on the table for their families, so they did infrastructure make-work projects in Canada and the US. 50 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, 50 billion in Canada, around there, we don't know the exact number, maybe Mr. Best does. 50 billion was put into an injection in the Canadian economy. Why the heck can't 50 or 100 billion be put toward First Nations crisis? If Canadians don't join with us to try and encourage the federal government to do that, like, see, the way I look at this simply is, you have to take calculated risks to make business happen. Our social institutions like schools, hospitals, elders facilities to care for them, disabled kids on reserve, and by the way, if you have a severely handicapped kid on your reserve, you have to give it up for adoption, because the federal government isn't going to fund in any great source for the parents if those kids need 24-hour care. What quality of life is that you're telling the family? Let your kid go out and get adopted, then they can get money so that kid can be looked after, but you as a parent can't get money to care for that kid in your own home. It's absolutely disgusting. But it's those types of things that we have to continue to endure and put up with. But if Canada, who has about $600 billion and counting in debt, is trying to tell us as First Nations we don't know how to manage our fiscal affairs, mainstream Canadians should be disgusted and outraged. If Attawapiskat was a challenge, and they have major housing crisis, and I said this to the media, but they didn't air it Canada-wide. CBC did on the radio network. The cameras in my face didn't. I said, Chief Spence may not be the poster child for fiscal integrity, but the social plight in her community we agree 100% with. And I maintain that as a chief. And many of us as chiefs have said that. They don't air it. Those sound bites don't hit. But Attawapiskat and the absolute grossness of some of their housing conditions, even with some of the fiscal, let's say, questionable management practices they had, even if they managed it all prudently, that wasn't going to solve all their crisis. And there's many First Nations far worse off than that. And all you professionals in the room who are here, who are brilliant minds and God-gifted talents, couldn't do a darn thing in our communities and probably won't if we don't pay you. You need to live and provide for your families and pay your payrolls and all those things. But for some of the bands that don't have the money, And we're one of the wealthiest in Alberta, maybe one of the wealthiest in Canada. But even with the wealth we have from this casino, we still have $150 to $200 billion crisis for all the housing needs, 500 homes, all our roads, sewage, proper infrastructure, on and on. So, saying some of these things for a few minutes here, as grateful as I am for people to come to the conference, and as grateful as I am for everybody to share the success stories of what's going on. That's how we all learn, that's how we all grow, and that's how we all improve. We see and look at the successes in various communities. But a lot of you people in this room as Albertans and Canadians, and many of us as First Nations who know the reality, are all in denial with Canadian mainstream government and provincial. If they don't believe that, some serious retooling and rethinking and legislative amendments have to happen on true revenue sharing with First Nations to get out of the crisis. And ironically, in closing by saying this, not an economics professor, but from some of the ones that I do know, who are very smart, brilliant economic minds, you know that if when the crisis happened in Canada and the US, they did the injections, they wanted to just do basic stimulus package, create jobs, do infrastructure. Of course, they always need to upgrade infrastructure mainstream, provide people with opportunities to buy your basic goods of cars, household furnishings, everything. Well, First Nations need $100 billion for housing, and they need another $50 billion in infrastructure. Well, where's that money going to be spent? If the federal government puts the injection, it's going to be spent back in the Canadian economy. But thinking that in Canada and Alberta, something major on revenue sharing, Premier Redford, as much as I appreciate the tough job she's got, and Prime Minister Harper, these two talk. They know what I've been saying. They know what other chiefs have been saying. And you people in this room are going to hear it loud and clear over the next days, weeks, and months. And I hope to join with Island No More on this, as chiefs and Island No More, so we can have a meeting of the minds. Revenue sharing has to happen. There was a theft. The biggest theft in Canadian history, which has built this country. Let's quit denying it. But let's be mature enough as adults, elected officials, and work through how we can truly revenue share so First Nations can coexist and start to build that quality of life and get on with a lot of the stuff we're talking about here today and over the next couple of days. Infrastructure, sustainable communities, those types of things. So I hope you guys do enjoy your conference. I do thank you for coming to the River Cree. Maybe some of you haven't heard this message as strongly as you've heard it today, but it needs to be said. But we do need your support also. And if mainstream Albertans and Canadians or municipal government officials don't want to stand with us to say, okay, if we don't do revenue sharing and the province and the feds don't want it, and some of the multinational corporations walking away and boasting of billions of dollars of profit every quarter to give out even more to shareholders who are already so bloody wealthy, and they don't want to say, okay, a portion of this has to go back to the First Nations as a First Nations tax or First Nations admin surcharge, whatever the heck we want to call it. Let's find a legislative process to do it. But let's allow real dollars to go back to First Nations so they can get on with providing that quality of life for not just this, but the future generations to come after us who don't have a hope in hell of any real quality of life. Other than what? If they just abandon their reserve and try to melt into mainstream, and then basically kick their ancestors in the head who, when treaty was signed, had a lot of this stolen from them. You as mainstream, how would you feel if you had to do that? We as First Nations can't do that. I wouldn't be able to go to my grave knowing if I didn't fight my hardest and try my best to right that injustice, I wouldn't be able to probably rest properly. So that being said, we want to work with you. We appreciate a lot of you as professionals in the mainstream. We're so proud, like I said initially, of our Native and Aboriginal people who are in the professional capacities, but you professionals and Aboriginals know what your community struggles are and what they're going through. And your heart bleeds for them, but you can't solve it. And you in this room who are in the mainstream can help. And Mr. Best, you can take the message back, as I'm sure many of you have heard, but even more passionately. It has to happen. Why can a First Ministers Conference with the chiefs not happen where they all sit down and talk about true revenue sharing? Because I'll leave you guys with this thought. I've asked the federal government to do this for years, and they haven't. Canadians, the mainstreams, provincial and federally, should ask themselves why they haven't. Do an analysis with all the brightest minds, or some of the brightest minds in the universities, and with all the infrastructure departments throughout Canada, and say, okay, for First Nations, what they receive through Indian and Northern Affairs Canada funding, the 10 billion, 8, 12, whatever the figure is, there's always shell game going on, some being pulled back, programs being announced, others being cut back, and we know some of it's just such a sick shell game, and we're sick of it. But if you were to give First Nations funding and transfer payments equivalent to municipalities, towns, and hamlets, we know as First Nations, based on some of our own rough calculations, you're looking at 2 to 3 times the 10 billion they currently give. The federal government will not pay for paving of roads on reserves. But provincial and federal grants allow for that for municipalities, towns, and hamlets and other jurisdictions. All the water and proper infrastructure needed and the cost sharing everybody sees going on, 75-25, usually federal, provincial, for municipalities, or municipality share, all of those types of things. Let's just get the analysis done. What would it be? It would cost far more if they were to say, no Indian affairs, let's do direct transfer payments like town, municipalities, and hamlets. Because the land base and all the calculations, federal government don't want to do it, and neither would provincial. But that being said, I do wish you all well, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Please do join us. You know, take some time to think about some of the things that I said, and try to nudge some of your colleagues along the way to say, why don't we as Canadians talk about true revenue sharing, you know, and see how First Nations can get out of this plight. Anyway. Hi, thank you for allowing me this time to speak, and all the best to Tanya and everyone and some of the professionals here in the room and who are speaking today over the next couple of days. Thanks.